welcome back to the next panel. We have a terrific panel to discuss issues around Taiwan. And of course, this is particularly relevant in recent months. It has become part of the debate with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China seems to be breathing down on Taiwan more than ever at this point of time. But we have 50 minutes, and I have 5 panelists to take us through some of these questions. So I won't go into any lengthy introduction of the subject itself, but let me do a quick introduction of my panelists here. I have former Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Carl Bildt, former President Slovenia and current President Club Madrid, Danilo Turk, Peter Baer, Member Parliament of Germany, Ambassador Sujin Chenoy, Director General Manoeuvre Institute for Defense Studies Analysis, India, and Lynn Cook, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security, IISS, International Institute of Strategic Studies, based in Singapore. So let me start with a very soft and easy question to all the panelists. We are 1 year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's a lot of talk about China's timetable for reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. And of course, considering that the Taiwanese are not going to be willingly agree to a reunification with the mainland, what are the prospects for China using force to accomplish this particular goal? And what is the likely timetable for any such military operation? Let me start with you, former Prime Minister Bildt.
Well, everything is fairly hypothetical, but one thing is, 2 things to start. I think the situations the 2 ones that you mentioned are very, very different. Very difficult to compare them. Secondly, China is very much committed to the territorial integrity of China. We've seen that over the years in situations like Tibet, Xinjiang. Taiwan is of the same category. We shouldn't make any mistakes in that particular respect. Is there going to be some sort of major crisis of a kinetic nature, as the Americans would say? Can't be excluded. I don't think it is a given, and everything is going to be dependent upon the circumstances of that particular conflict. Were Taiwan to sort of unilaterally declare independence, supported by a couple of odd states, that would clearly trigger something. But we could also see other scenarios where one stumbles into a situation. Were there to be a military confrontation, Chinese invasion, out of the blue or as a result of an escalating crisis, I think the global effects would be profound. And that has to do with the fact that if you look at the map, envisage a military conflict in that area where a substantial part of the foreign trade of the world passes, that trade will stop happening. Irrespectively of sanctions or things like that, it will stop. And that would collapse to a large extent, for a start, the Chinese economy, which is very dependent upon imports. It will have major effects for the European economy and for all other economies. So it's a very, very major scenario, which I don't think anyone, including the Chinese leadership, would enter into without very, very thoughtful preparations.
President Turk, what do you think of, from a Slovenian perspective, how do you see the Chinese timetable for a possible reunification of Taiwan using military force?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that the current atmosphere in Europe, of course, is very special. It's very special because of the surprise that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has produced, the massive scale, the amount of suffering, the number of refugees. That has created a very special atmosphere. And I think that it would be inaccurate to actually analyze any other situation anywhere else in the world based on this kind of very special psychology which prevails currently in Europe and which actually has united European countries very strongly, much beyond what we have known before. And I think that this sort of special circumstances are not likely to happen in any with any comparison in the future. Now, coming from a country which is European, Slovenia, which has been very much focused on the European issues, I must say that very critically that the people have not been paying much attention to crises outside Europe. And I was personally very unhappy to see the lack of interest for the situation in Yemen, for example, which is a terrible situation, but really very little attention is paid to it in Europe. I myself, on another matter, I have put together a project to help the Palestinian children in Gaza affected by war, and even there it was very difficult to kind of mobilize public opinion. So I think that there is a problem in Europe, and of course that problem varies from one country to another. But of course one has to look at the broader picture, and if one looks at the broader picture, one must not overlook details, and I would like to mention just one detail. And that is the recent paper that China produced on the question of the war in Ukraine. This is not a peace plan, it's a position paper, but it includes a very important element, which is, I think, number 2 in the 12-point paper. And that element is basically about abandoning Cold War mentality, as it says, abandoning Cold War mentality, which is then explained as accepting the need that countries that strengthen their defense or their security must do so in a manner which doesn't threaten anybody else. Well, that's a very interesting point of departure, a very good platform, and I think that applies to everybody. It applies to United States, of course, it applies to China as well. And the design of security measures and security policies should really take cognizance of that, and perhaps this is something that should be discussed much more in depth in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Baer, can I come to you on the German position on if China were to use military force on Taiwan, how would Germany position itself?
First of all, thank you very much.
And what do you think of the timetable more than anything else?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that very important topic on the agenda of this conference. It is not a new topic, and for those who have been dealing with the region, it has been on the top of the agenda for quite some time. But if you're asking me for the German perspective, I have to admit that this is only a quite recent addition to our political agenda for several reasons. We are not a Pacific nation, we are more like transatlantic oriented, but of course we cannot deny that we also have interest there. And Carl Bildt and the speakers before me already alluded to the fact that we have heavily invested interests, not only in mainland China, but in the whole region. That has to do also with commercial things, with trade, and with a view to a timetable. I mean, we should not speculate too much, but then again, we need to prepare. But because don't make any mistake, China, the People's Republic of China, is very well and very concretely preparing for an invasion, a military invasion of Taiwan. I think that is a fact that nobody can deny. So Germany, what Germany did with its very limited capacities, military-wise, was to send a frigate through the South China Sea to show some presence, and not living under the illusion that we can really have a military influence in that regard, but to show solidarity with Taiwan, but also beyond Taiwan, with the countries of the region that are like-minded, who are potential or already existing partners, that they show that Germans and Germany really does care. And I think we should maintain that present and that important political and also military signal of solidarity. When I say mainly in China, the People's Republic is certainly preparing for something, that is proved by a lot of provocation. We see a lot of a vastly increased military presence also in the air. Chinese Air Force is doing a vastly increased presence and violating airspace, and so flexing his muscles to show we can actually do something. But of course, Xi Jinping, the regime in Beijing, should also take into consideration there will be solidarity internationally. Certainly the United States of America have an interest, by the way, as a not only Atlantic but also Pacific nation. They have a much larger interest for quite some while already with regard to South China Sea, to the Strait of Taiwan, and to Taiwan itself. And the current president of the United States of America has made it very clear that if something happens, the United States will immediately give a very clear answer. And I would like to invite everyone who thinks that Taiwan should make a sovereign decision as a sovereign country, live up to that conviction and join in the club of solidarity with the United States of America. And again, from a German perspective, by the way, this is not the official government position, and where I'm not a member of, is that we should maintain our presence there and also help Taiwan with official visits by delegations of both parliamentarians and business people, and help prepare Taiwan with regard to civil society, with regard to intelligence and many other things, to become stronger, to become more resilient, to be prepared for any kind of mainland China's activities that are certainly to come in the future. Timeline, I don't know, but make no mistake, it will happen within the next 2 to 5 years.
Great. I'm going to come back to you on this, some of the German support that you talked about. But Ambassador Chinay, what do you think of from an Indian perspective, what do you think of the Chinese possible timeline tangible to kind of reunite Taiwan with the mainland? So do you think that is a feasibility of China using force to do that?
Thank you. I think before we address that issue, we must see the differences between the situation in Ukraine and the situation across the Taiwan Strait. The first difference is that Ukraine is a member of the United Nations, and Taiwan has not been a member since the passage of UNGA Resolution 2758 of 25 October 1971, when the General Assembly decided to remove Chiang Kai-shek and his representatives. Mind you, it did not refer to either Taiwan or to the Republic of China. And when they brought in what they called the legitimate entry of the People's Republic of China. Having said that, Ukraine did not have a treaty alliance partnership before the war broke out. In the case of Taiwan, although the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1954 petered out during Jimmy Carter's time in 1979, it was seamlessly integrated, it segued into the Taiwan Relations Act, as you are aware of, 1979, which has two fundamental tenets. One is that unification must be peaceful and that any other scenario would be resisted by the United States of America. And that secondly, the United States would provide necessary arms and military assistance for the defensive purposes required by Taiwan. Now the question is, what exactly are the timelines? As far as China is concerned, it's been very consistent, saying that this is a historic mission. And there are two centenary goals. The first one is already over by 2021, making China a moderately well-off society. But it's the second centenary goal which is in fact relevant to Taiwan. China hopes to achieve the China Dream by 2049. I dare say that no Chinese leader can stand on the rostrum of the Forbidden City at Tiananmen Square and declare the achievement of the China Dream without reunification. So in my view, essentially there is a timeline called 2049. Would China do it? I doubt it, because it is likely to derail China's own economic trajectory, and the costs of sanctions and restrictions, international isolation would be very huge. At the same time, if China were to do it, how would it do it? I think there are three scenarios here. One is to use the missile capability across the Taiwan Strait, which Taiwan has developed since the 94-95 Taiwan Strait crisis, which was effectively a very important one when the US had sent out carrier battle groups as well. Incidentally, since then, the carrier battle groups of the United States have gone in my view, please correct me if I'm wrong, only once, when the USS Kitty Hawk went in 2007 for an R&R visit to Hong Kong, which was refused, and on the way back, the US steamed through the Taiwan Strait. Since then, the US performs its right to traverse these straits, but has not sent a carrier battle group. Mind you, that's important in naval terms. Now, missile attack is one thing, but the Taiwanese also have considerable missile capabilities. The second way to do it is to mount a naval invasion. And I think traversing 180 miles of open sea would really decimate any such operation. The third is essentially to mount an economic embargo and a blockade. But this too will threaten the United States and Japan and Australia when it comes to free trade in the Western Pacific. I have absolutely no doubt that were the Chinese to try to sort of take off and in a different direction and use force against Taiwan in accordance with their 2005 anti-secession law, the United States will directly be involved. Japan, which considers Taiwan to be its outer periphery in terms of security, will 100% be involved. I dare say even Australia will be involved.
Thank you. And let me come to Lynn Cook in terms of how do you see the same question in terms of what are the Chinese timelines for reunification of Taiwan and use of military force to do that?
Thank you for your question, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be in this room with everyone. I think the question of prospects of China using force against Taiwan, as well as the timeline for doing that, is a difficult one and must begin, I suppose, with the recent, relatively recent testimony by the then Indo-Pacific commander before the US Senate Armed Services Committee. And in his testimony, he said that he thought that China had Taiwan amongst its ambitions in the next 6 years. And he spoke in 2021, so we're talking 2027. The basis, though, of the Admiral's assessment is far from clear. He didn't state it, as far as I could see, in his testimony. Nor is it clear that the US White House shares his assessment or that the US allies and partners, including its intelligence allies and partners, share that. So that's not clear at all to me. I think what might be useful instead of kind of identifying a date is perhaps to identify factors that might impact on China's decision to attack or take Taiwan. And I think the first of these must be its military capacity. And the second would be a considered decision, an intent to take Taiwan. And sometimes these two factors are conflated or taken together. So for instance, I think many Taiwanese or Taiwanese analysts consider that if China has the military capabilities to take Taiwan, it will. So military capabilities and intent are equal. But I think it's useful analytically, at least, to break it down. In terms of military capabilities, what are we looking at? First, we would look, of course, at Taiwan's own military capabilities in terms of its ability to hold fort against China whilst it waited for the US and its allies and partners, if any, in that respect, to come to Taiwan's aid, so Taiwan's capacity. And then, of course, we must look at whether China's increasingly sophisticated missile developments will be able to enable it to deny the US access into the relevant sphere, in which case that makes it far more difficult for the US to come to Taiwan's aid, and of course increases the chance of China being able to successfully take Taiwan, to win a war against Taiwan quickly. And then on the issue of intention, I mean, I think it's very clear to all in the room that if Taiwan were to declare independence, that would be a clear red line. But if we look at China's legislation, we can also see other instances where China says that it might well, use force to take Taiwan. So if we look at China's 2005 Anti-Succession Act, it also identifies another two conditions or criteria, conditions under which it would take Taiwan. Those are not very clearly formulated, but I think one amongst the two of them is about all other peaceful means of reunification have been exhausted. I think what's clear is how unclear the statements are. So it gives China some flexibility in terms of when it determines that it should and could take Taiwan. Then, of course, there are other factors. To what extent will what China considers U.S. provocation impact its decision? So, for instance, the recent Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, China was upset, but would that be a game changer in terms of its decision to go to war? I doubt that such visits will be in and of itself sufficient to provoke war, but there are other possibilities as well. U.S. legislation, to what extent will that impact China's decision? So I'm just laying out a series of factors which might be useful, or a framework to consider in considering when China might lean towards an attack on Taiwan.
Thank you. Terrific. Let me now go with the second round of questions, first to Prime Minister Carl Bildt. Sweden has been neutral for a very long time, but recently sought to join NATO because, of course, the heightened threat from Russia. But when it comes to China, I think it's a mixed baggage sort of thing. Sweden, of course, has very solid relations, economic ties with China, but also has had some tensions with China, including China's apparent support for Russia. Given this, what is the likely Swedish response to any possible Chinese military action on Taiwan? How far does economic interest constrain or complicate Sweden as well as other European powers, their position on Taiwan?
I don't think there will be any Swedish response whatsoever. There will be a European response, and Sweden will be part of that. And any European response will be highly coordinated. That's a lesson from Ukraine, by the way. Okay. Will be highly coordinated with the American response. The American response will, of course, be, if it's a military conflict, primarily military. The European military contribution would be distinctly limited, I would say, also for the fact that I think the Americans would prefer to run that war by themselves. They have prepared for doing that together with some key allies in the region, but I don't think they would appreciate sort of the odd Swedish vessel turning up in the middle of the fray. We discussed earlier before what would happen in the United Nations. That's highly uncertain, whether there will be any possibility to bring the issue up in the United Nations even, and how that will be done. But clearly, the European reaction against the Chinese will be negative. Then the economic impact will be massive. Irrespective, as I said earlier, irrespective of sanctions. Russia is, with the exception of a couple of products, oil and gas, a very marginal player in the global economy, even a very marginal player in the European economy. China is a very major player in every aspect of the global economy. If we talk about 2049 or some timelines like that, it's likely to be the world's biggest economy, to be precise. But as I said, we should not forget that China is also highly dependent upon world trade. And if there's a major conflict in the east of Asia, with all air routes and maritime routes and whatever closed, the ramification for the internal stability of China is also going to be fairly massive. So I think sanctions will certainly happen, but sanctions will be fairly minor in their effects if you compare it to the effects of closing down maritime and air routes over an area that is of absolutely central importance for the global economy. Be that from the food import of China to the semiconductor dependence on the Western economy.
Excellent. President Turk and question about of course, we have seen a fair amount of significant consolidation of the West, especially including the European democracies when it came to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Slovenia itself has been strongly in support of Ukraine. But one of the criticism has also been that Europeans are concerned only about what happens in Europe. So if there is a war over Taiwan, which is also a fellow democracy, can we expect Europe to show support for Taiwan as we have seen in the case of Ukraine? What kind of show of support would we see in the case of Taiwan as against Ukraine?
This is a highly hypothetical question. And I would like to say that the hypothetical concepts based on expectation of an armed conflict are not something that I would favor or Europeans in general would favor. And I think that there are several things one can think about in this context. Do we really want to go into hypothetical discussions on the possible war and create a self-fulfilling prophecy? No, we don't want that. And then if we look, okay, what are the alternatives? There are alternatives, and we can start, I think, basically with what then Secretary General of the Communist Party of China, Mao, said to President Nixon during this historic visit in February 1972. Taiwan is important for us, but not urgent. He said we can wait for 100 years. No, he removed the notion of urgency from that, and that allowed many things to happen, most of which were very positive. Now, let us ask ourselves today, what would be a positive alternative? An alternative which would not be based on a kind of inevitability of armed conflict. This conflict is not inevitable, it is avoidable. And if we look into what is discussed in terms or in context of avoidable nature of this situation, we can see interesting concepts emerging. One of them I quoted before, that is the withdrawal or abandonment of Cold War mentality. I think this is a good idea, but it applies to everybody. Everybody should abandon Cold War zero-sum game mentality. The other is the idea of managed strategic competition. So there is a competition, but it can be managed. And there are elements in that competition which can call for greater cooperation that we currently see. For example, on global warming clearly is one. Then another one relates to the global financial stability, very important for everybody. And there are more specific security-related aspects where also cooperation is possible. For example, on the code of conduct on South China Sea. I know that many so-called realists don't expect much about it, but let us see. Maybe there is more potential that we currently realize. And then obviously there are questions where we can draw inspiration from past experience. For example, Soviet Union and United States had a very important agreement on avoidance of incidents in the high seas. That was an important instrument, which is legally very clearly defined, and it could serve as an element of inspiration for hypotheses that do not build or do not imply the idea that armed conflict is somehow unavoidable. I think it is avoidable. It is by no means, necessary, and we, I think, should, put all our energy in finding the ways in which this, hypothesis will start building around peaceful resolution or peaceful future.
Unavoidable, sort of avoidable. So let's see how far China holds that peace in Taiwan across the straits. Let me come to Mr. Peter Baer. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Beijing recently with a big business delegation. Of course, this has raised a lot of concerns because even in the case of Russia, Germany in particular has been accused of putting its economic interests first and ignoring the military threat. Given the heavy economic investment in China, what are the prospects that Germany will take a strong stand in case if there is a crisis over Taiwan?
Thanks for that question. Please allow me to briefly come back to Daniel Türk, what he said. I totally agree with everything that he says, but as hypothetical as that question might be, and now I refer to that we should not speculate too much about any timelines, but at the same time, we should not use that as a narrative to avoid preparation for if something happens. Please keep that in mind. Otherwise, I don't want to hear anybody else in this room or beyond in any capitals of this world to wake up and say, oh, I'm surprised. I never saw that coming. Of course, we should use all strength in investing to avoid any conflict or war or anything of that scale. But at the same time, please prepare. I think that is a responsibility of leaders, of political leaders, and of business leaders as well. To your question now. So it bought me some time because that was a question that. So I could start with saying, well, yes, the German Chancellor does not belong to my party. I'm in the opposition.
Of course.
But that would be too easy. Truth of the matter is that my Chancellor, his current Chancellor's predecessor, Angela Merkel, I'm a big fan of her, from my party. Great leader. We all miss her. But she has been numerous times visiting Beijing and China. She has been criticized for this, sure. But actually I think she was quite right, because she always took a chance to address human rights issues, Uyghurs, rule of law issues, yeah. What's going on in Hong Kong. Every time, when there was a meeting either in Berlin or in Beijing with the leaders of China, of the Communist Party, she did so. Not always publicly on a stage, but sometimes she did that in front of the running TV cameras, but she also did that. So the most recent trip by the current German Chancellor with a huge business delegation was badly timed. It was just a week after the party convention of the Chinese Communist Party. And also, French President Macron said, hey, let's do that together. Wouldn't it be a great signal of strength of Europe, of solidarity? And well, we are aligned in our approach, in our political position towards Beijing, especially during these times, where there's also support of China, of Russian Federation against, in the war against Ukraine. So let's do something European together, Germany and China and France together. The German Chancellor said no. And I think that was a mistake. And also, so timing was a mistake to show, the cold shoulder to the French president, and also to have a big business delegation. In normal times, that would be considered normal. But we are not living in normal times, and I would expect of a German Chancellor to realize that. So using platforms is good, and opportunities to talk, yes, but nothing, by the way, in the end, came out of that. We are, especially German car manufacturers, are vastly dependent on the gigantic Chinese market. I think 40 or 50% even of like Mercedes-Benz and Audi and Volkswagen are being sold in China on the Chinese market. So there's a dependency. But we should also be aware that we should not manifest and cement and even increase these dependencies. I think also but not only political leaders, but also the business leaders, the C-level guys, on the stock exchanges, in the group of companies who are listed there, they have a responsibility. They shouldn't turn a blind eye what is, against being done by the Chinese leadership in Xinjiang with regard to the Uyghurs. That has been very well known for many years, but there were people turning a blind eye on that. There has been media coverage on a smaller scale many years before. So we certainly have to take into consideration and keep in mind the security interest, the absolutely more than legitimate security interest of the countries of the region who live under the suppression or the coercion maybe even of China, which is Taiwan, which is also the security interest of this country where we are in, the largest democracy on the planet, with the largest population on this planet, which is called India. And you suffer from the, from what China is doing with regard to violent violation of your borders in the northeast and the Himalaya region. So we have to take that into consideration when Germany is doing China politics.
Thank you. Let me come to Ambassador Chinoy. A question about the global south, and on Ukraine, you have seen significant support for Ukraine, generally global support. But also some parts of the global south, this is especially in Africa, this has not been really the case. They have not been as enthusiastic about calling out Russia by name for the invasion. Are we going to see something slightly differently if there is a crisis over Taiwan? And I'm asking this given that there is significant Chinese economic investment, aid, infrastructure projects, and so on and so forth. So what kind of support are we likely to see from a global south, especially in the African context, for a Taiwan crisis?
So first we need to look at the possibility of an immediate crisis. I painted to you a longer term timetable in terms of 2049 the so-called achievement of the China dream, which would be impossible for any leader to declare without some kind of reunification. What is possible in the immediate future is a potential takeover, theoretically, hypothetically speaking, of the islands that are outlying, Chinman and Matsu, which are within 10 nautical miles of the mainland. Now, some of you may recall that when the Mutual Defense Treaty was concluded in December 1954, its description is very clearly limited to Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, that is the Pescadores. Yeah. It does not include the outlying islands, and therefore, even after the conclusion of the Mutual Defense Treaty, in the first and the second Taiwan Strait crisis, China bombarded those islands. This theoretically is possible even today. More than that, it is theoretically possible for China to mount an invasion of these two islands and take them over without necessarily triggering the Taiwan Relations Act, which also has the same description, limited to Taiwan and the Penghu Islands. That being said, why would China do that? It is a possible face-saving device before 2049. It is a scenario in which these lightly defended islands may not be worth, for the United States, the game may not be worth the candle, so that's a possibility. The action at the UN is limited. It's in favor of China, not just because Taiwan is not a member, but because virtually every country in the world except 13 have recognized the People's Republic of China. And we have seen in the past that the divisions are also to be seen within the allies. For instance, when in 1950, Taiwan, that is Formosa, took a resolution, as in proposed a resolution at the United Nations as Resolution 87 of 29 September 1950, the UK and the USA voted differently. On the eve of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which I mentioned earlier, of 25 October 1971, the UK had actually, sort of proposed views against the USA, which was trying to provide a parallel seat and participation to Taiwan. So I think generally speaking, whether it's the G77 plus China grouping, whether it's Africa, the dice is generally loaded against Taiwan. Now in Africa, you know that the Chinese have trade worth roughly $285 billion. They have investments worth $70 billion. And although the United States is ramping up its presence in Africa considerably, the fly in the ointment here is that many of the Millennium Challenge Corporation projects also cannot altogether avoid Belt and Road type of projects. In other words, Chinese companies also bid for MCC projects. So that's the irony over there. The G7 is united today on giving Taiwan space in the World Health Assembly, or for instance the ICAO, or for instance the UN Framework for Climate Change Convention. That's the space in which the world can actually help Taiwan.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lynn. Let me come to you. On what can, I think generally we have seen, can the like-minded countries come together, fellow democracies come together, a whole range of options have been said. But what can other countries do in order to affect China's calculations and specifically to deter any Chinese resort to use of force on Taiwan? And what do you see from the region also in terms of the perceptions and possible actions?
Thanks for your question. Let me just focus on Southeast Asia, the region from which I come. I think it's quite clear that Southeast Asia isn't going to be a game changer in terms of impacting or affecting China's calculations. Nonetheless, it can help to complicate the strategic environment in terms of making it more difficult for China to make the decision to invade Taiwan. The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy late last year in December 2022 published a report that examined how to preserve peace and deter conflict, which focus on the Taiwan issue. And in that report, the authors and editors made several recommendations. So first was for Southeast Asia to enhance maritime domain awareness. Second, for it to build up capacity so that it would create a less permissive environment for the PLA to operate. Third, for countries in Southeast Asia to be vigilant against security agreements, so no security agreements with China that would allow it to operate more easily against Taiwan. And fourth, that Southeast Asia should signal that it would not remain neutral should China attack Taiwan. The difficulty, of course, in all of this is that Southeast Asian countries would prefer not to get involved at all. So they are loath to seek to deter any Chinese action, even before the action occurs, much less to take action much less to take any forceful action in the event of a Taiwan contingency. And the reason behind this is quite clear. All countries adopt a one China policy. And so they see the situation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to be quite a different situation from a Chinese taking of Taiwan. And the other reason, of course, is pragmatic. And this affects many countries, not just Southeast Asia, namely the extensive economic agreements and arrangements that they have with China. And this would, of course, would be hurting their rice bowls. And that's not something they really welcome. And this would extend also to the case of Singapore, which amongst the Southeast Asian countries took the strongest stance against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not just condemning the action as a violation of international law and principles of sovereignty, but also imposing economic sanctions on Russia. But I think the situation might be quite different in the case of any Chinese action against Taiwan. This doesn't mean that the countries will not will not assist Taiwan in some way, but of course this would also depend on the state and trajectory of economic relations, not just with the United States, but also with China.
Thank you, Lynn. I think it's been kind of clear. I think there are a lot of the economic interests clearly dominate the kind of response that we're seeing. We are less than 3 minutes, but I want to take 2 quick questions from our Raisina young fellows. So if there are 2 quick, sharp, crisp questions, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Clara. I come from Germany. I would like to address to what Mr. Chinoy said. There's only 13 countries in the world that actually recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. And with all due respect to you, Mr. Bayer, and also to Angela Merkel, I do believe what happened in Russia and what we see there is that we do need a clear focus on what Europe can do in territories where they're not that close to. So I would want to ask you, why doesn't the European Union or European countries actually recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country? Thank you.
Thank you. Second question.
Hi, I'm Esther. I'm from South Korea. I have a question on the regional security dynamics in Europe and Asia. So while Europe has NATO, Asia has several different regional security mechanisms like the AUKUS or the US, Japan, Korea military cooperation. Can you talk to us a little bit about how ready you think such security alliances in Asia are to respond to possible warfare in the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan? Do you think the region needs something like an Indo-Pacific NATO? Thank you.
Okay. Who want to go first on the European question? Okay.
Can I add a third question, please?
Okay, very short. We are less than just 1 minute.
I'm Mariam. I'm from Egypt. So my question is that nowadays we have several maritime security initiatives. Won't the militarization of the Indo-Pacific region, including the South China Sea, affect the world trade routes and supply chains, and accordingly endangering the whole world population? And how can the world community cooperate to prevent any foreseeable military confrontation in order to protect the world trade?
Okay.
Especially that similar is happening now in the Black Sea. So
yeah, got the
thank you so much.
Okay, let me start with Mr. Baer.
If I may, just to the first question, I don't know if that was a plea or a wish, but anyway, so the complexity of the European Union, as you very well know, makes it a sheer impossibility to have a unanimous vote on something like a EU vote on a recognition of Taiwan as a sovereign state. And as you also know, that Germany's official position is we have this one China policy, and we have not recognized Taiwan as well. So there's a lot of upheaval currently to what I earlier alluded at, which is actually quite a good idea. that parliamentarians and business delegations, but especially parliamentarians from different political parties that are represented in the German National Parliament, which is the Bundestag, where I'm also a member of, are currently visiting Taiwan. There's always a big mass and media coverage, and routinely Beijing is protesting and everything. But it takes some, responsibility comes with making decisions, with living up to your beliefs, to your values, and not shying and hiding behind them. I'm always a very big fan of having clear positions, and I applaud to the colleagues. I have not done so yet. I applaud the colleagues who are doing so and traveling to Taipei, because they do that, what I think should also be done by political leaders. This might be perceived, or certainly will be perceived, as a provocation, but I really want to see more of that, because that is leadership, that is responsibility. This is not like a soft job that people are having. They are elected by their respective citizens into responsible offices as heads of state, as government leaders, to position yourself and to protect also the interests of your citizens. And I think that belongs into that regime. Indo-Pacific NATO, I would probably pass that along.
Lynn, if you can
to Lynn, for example. she's from that region, although I have my own opinion to that, but maybe Lynn?
30 seconds, Lynn, on the Asian NATO question.
Sure. 30 seconds. Go. Does the Indo-Pacific region need a NATO? I think insofar it's desirable, it would just be a pipe dream. There's certainly no appetite for anything like that in the region. We're looking at countries in the region being very disparate, having different interests, having different relations with the major powers, with the great powers like United States, like China. And also I think there's a very low risk appetite for any militarization in that sense, and any formal military component to approaching the region. And I think the region would far rather have peace secured through some sort of military presence, but mainly through economic engagement. So that was on the Indo-Pacific NATO. I think on the militarization of the South China Sea, let me briefly touch on that. I think we need to distinguish between different so-called militarizations of the South China Sea. There is China's building of fortresses on features that are disputed. I think that's clearly not ideal. It's a gray zone in international law whether you're entitled to militarize features over which sovereignty is disputed, but I think the fact that it's disputed suggests that you should not build and change the nature of these features. However, China also calls the US and other naval vessels that fly through the South China Sea, it considers that sort of action also to be militarizing the South China Sea. I think that's wrong. These are just countries, naval powers, asserting their passage and other maritime rights through the South China Sea. I think this is important in order to keep the waters of the South China Sea open and free. And I think it's also important insofar as it preserves the passage of maritime and overflight rights that are vested under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Because if you don't use your rights, you lose your rights. So I think it's very important to distinguish between those two different components of militarization and say no to the first and yes to the second.
Thank you. We are completely out of time, but I want to give a hand of applause to all our speakers today for a terrific conversation. Thank you.